Before the surgery, the last thing I remember was counting backward from 10 while a kind nurse named Ranatata held my hand. She smiled gently and assured me, "When you wake up, it'll all be over." She was right about that part. After spending 9 hours under anesthesia for a spinal fusion to repair 2 severely herniated discs that had left me barely able to walk, I finally opened my eyes in the recovery room. My mouth felt as dry as sandpaper, and my body no longer seemed like it belonged to me. A nurse checked my blood pressure, smiled, and told me the operation had gone well. Then she asked if I wanted my phone. Still dazed, I nodded, expecting nothing more than a message from my boss or maybe a simple, "Get well soon," from a coworker. Instead, the screen lit up with 73 missed calls. I stared at the number in disbelief while my hands began to shake, not because the anesthesia was wearing off, but because something felt terribly wrong. Most of those calls were from my mother. There were more than a dozen from my father, several from my sister, Ivana, and a few from numbers I didn't recognize. My first thought was that something terrible had happened to my grandmother, who had been going in and out of the hospital for months. My heart pounded as I opened the voicemail my father had left just 3 hours after my surgery had begun. His voice was calm. Far too calm. "Molly, sweetheart, it's Dad. We know this isn't the best time, but we didn't have another option. We sold your condo. We needed the money for Ivana's wedding. Everything became so expensive. The venue fell through, the caterer doubled the price, and since you were under anesthesia, your mother and I signed the paperwork for you. Don't worry. Everything's taken care of. We'll explain when you're feeling better." I listened to the message 3 times before the meaning truly hit me. My condo. The home I had bought just 2 years earlier after saving every extra dollar from endless double shifts as a project coordinator. The place I had renovated with my own hands because I couldn't afford contractors. Every weekend had been spent ripping out old carpet, painting walls, and teaching myself how to install tile by watching YouTube tutorials. Every corner of that home carried a piece of my hard work. Now it was gone. A property worth $425,000 had been taken from me while I was lying unconscious on an operating table, my spine cut open, completely unable to speak, object, or even know what was happening. The nurse noticed the expression on my face and gently asked if my pain had gotten worse. "I'm fine," I whispered. It was the biggest lie I had ever told. I asked if I could have a few minutes alone. As soon as she stepped outside, I called my mother. She answered on the very first ring, her voice cheerful and hurried, talking excitedly about flower arrangements before I even had the chance to say hello. The moment I interrupted and asked how they had managed to sign documents for my condo, she fell silent for a second before replying with words that haunted me for weeks. "You gave your father power of attorney before the surgery, sweetheart. Just in case something happened. We simply used it a little more broadly than you intended." A little more broadly. That was how she described stealing my home. I ended the call before anger pushed me into saying something I would regret. My hands trembled against the hospital blanket as I stared at the ceiling. The power of attorney had been signed only weeks earlier, and it was supposed to cover medical decisions only. My father had insisted. "It's only a precaution," he had said while sliding the document across the kitchen table. "If something happens during surgery and you can't speak for yourself, someone needs to make medical decisions." At the time, it had sounded reasonable. Looking back, I realized he hadn't been handing me paperwork. He had been quietly unlocking a door he fully intended to walk through. Ivana's wedding was only 3 weeks away. I'd barely been included in any of the planning. My role had simply been to show up smiling and somehow pay for a designer dress I couldn't even afford. Now everything finally made sense. My mother hadn't pushed me to sign the document because she was worried about my surgery. She had pushed because they already knew exactly what they planned to do. Every movement sent pain shooting through the fresh incision in my back, but I still asked the nurse to bring me the laptop bag my neighbor had dropped off with a change of clothes. My hands were unsteady, and the medication still blurred my vision, but I forced myself to open my email. There was one contact I hadn't spoken to in almost 4 years. A real estate attorney named Deline Castor. She had helped me when I purchased my condo and specialized in property fraud and financial exploitation. Back then, I never imagined I would one day need her because of my own parents. With trembling fingers, I wrote an email explaining everything I could remember. I attached the copy of the power of attorney document I had saved in my files and pressed send. Then I called her. My throat felt tight, and my voice barely rose above a whisper. "Deline, was what my parents did even legal?" She didn't hesitate. There was no sympathy, no small talk, only calm professionalism. "Send me the document immediately." Less than an hour later, my phone rang again. "Molly," she said firmly, "I've reviewed it. This power of attorney clearly limits authority to medical decisions during your surgery. It gives your parents absolutely no legal authority over your finances or your property." She paused for only a moment before delivering the words that changed everything. This isn't a misunderstanding. It isn't a legal gray area. If they signed documents transferring your condo, it could amount to forgery, and depending on how the transaction was completed, possibly fraud as well. I sat frozen in my hospital bed. Those words settled inside me slowly, just like the anesthesia had worn off earlier that day, layer by layer, until every ounce of pain, betrayal, and disbelief hit me all at once. Then Deline asked one final question. Do you want to handle this quietly with a legal demand letter, or are you ready to take this much further? I thought about my father's emotionless voicemail, how casually he had said they didn't have a choice, as though he were discussing a broken appliance instead of the home I had sacrificed years to build. Then I remembered my mother's cold explanation. We just used it a little more broadly than you intended. Not a hint of guilt. Not an ounce of remorse. Ivana's wedding was only 3 weeks away, and for the first time, I realized that the celebration my family had spent months planning might become the very place where everything they had done finally came crashing down. The wedding that was only 3 weeks away was being financed with the money taken from my condo, and not a single person in my family had thought I deserved to be asked before making that decision. I looked at Deline and said, I want everything documented. I don't want shortcuts. I want this handled the right way. By the following morning, I was still recovering from surgery. I could barely make it to the bathroom without holding on to the 4-pole, but despite the pain, a plan was already taking shape. Deline immediately filed an emergency motion challenging the legality of the sale. She pointed out that the power of attorney was strictly limited to medical decisions and asked the court to freeze the transferred funds before the transaction became irreversible. That request gave us a small but priceless opportunity. The buyer's money was still sitting safely in escrow because the title transfer required one final signature verification that had not yet been completed. Deline argued that the verification could not legally move forward since the authorization used to sell my property appeared to be fraudulent. That same afternoon, my father called. His voice was nothing like the calm message he had left while I was unconscious. The escrow company contacted me, he said sharply. They're talking about a legal hold. What exactly have you done? I hired an attorney, I answered without hesitation. The sale is being challenged as fraudulent. If you want any chance of avoiding a police investigation for forgery, reverse everything immediately. Silence filled the line. It wasn't an awkward silence. It was the silence of someone realizing the person they had always been able to manipulate was no longer willing to stay quiet. For the first time in my life, my father understood that I wasn't going to apologize simply to keep peace in the family. My mother chose a different strategy. She called twice and filled my phone with messages accusing me of being selfish. She wrote that Ivana had already mailed the wedding invitations and proudly mentioned the beautiful venue, which had supposedly been made possible through family support. She insisted I was about to destroy months of planning by creating unnecessary drama just weeks before the wedding. I never answered. Instead, I asked Deline to handle every conversation from that point forward. I had spent years explaining myself to my mother, only to walk away feeling guilty for things that were never my fault. I refused to carry that burden anymore. 2 days later, exactly as Deline had hoped, the escrow company officially froze the transaction while the case was reviewed. The buyer wanted no part of a potential fraud investigation and immediately withdrew from the purchase. On paper, my condo was mine again. Unfortunately, the damage wasn't completely undone. Before the sale had officially closed, my parents had already withdrawn nearly $60,000 to pay deposits for the wedding venue and catering. That money had already been spent. None of it was refundable. My father was forced to visit the venue himself and explain that the transaction funding the wedding had become legally disputed. Later, my aunt told me the meeting had been humiliating. The venue coordinator asked several uncomfortable questions about whose name had actually been listed on the property and who had authorized the payment. According to her, my father walked out looking like a man who had aged years in a single afternoon. Eventually, Ivana called me. I hoped she wanted to understand. Instead, she asked if there was any way I could simply let everything go so the wedding could continue as planned. I took a deep breath before answering. This has never been about your wedding, I told her calmly. It's about the fact that our parents sold my home while I was unconscious in surgery. They never asked me, never told me, and never hesitated. Then I added quietly, I truly hope your wedding still happens. I just hope it isn't built on something that was taken from me without my knowledge. Over the following weeks, my parents were legally required to acknowledge that the property transfer was invalid. The title was officially restored to my name. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown. No television cameras. No sensational headlines. Just a stack of legal documents quietly reversing an equally quiet act of betrayal. But although my home was returned, my family would never be the same again. My father stopped calling. My mother sent one final message accusing me of being ungrateful. I never replied. Some silences speak louder than words ever could. Recovery came slowly. My spine healed one painful step at a time. So did my heart. The version of me that once believed family automatically deserved unlimited trust never came back. In its place stood someone who finally understood that love without respect is not love at all. If the people closest to you have ever crossed a line you never imagined they would, I hope my story reminds you of one important truth. Protecting yourself is never selfish. Sometimes, it's the only way to keep yourself from losing everything.